I'm Taylor here at Not Your Mama's Quilt Store, and today we are going to be making a puff quilt. If you've seen the traditional method of making a puff quilt, it can be pretty tricky and labor intensive. The typical method is going to have you sew a bunch of individual pouches and stuff them and sew them together. There is an easier way. So if you're looking at a puff quilt, like you want to make one, but it might be a little bit too difficult, we found a method that's a little bit less stressful for you, hopefully. So what you're going to start by doing is making a patchwork quilt top. These are 5-inch squares of fabric starting out. There's 8 squares by 10 squares, so that's just the general size you'll get out of that, but you can size it up depending on how large you want to make your squares, size it down and use more squares. I've even seen people using, just rows and rectangles, so you can do all kinds of fun stuff with this quilt to make it your own. I started with 8 squares by 10 squares for this one, and you just sew your squares together like you would a patchwork quilt top, and it'll come out something like this and then we're gonna start pleating it. So what I mean by that is I like to start in the center right here, and I'm not measuring, I'm just kind of eyeballing, and I'm folding each square right down the center with about 1/4 inch pleat. I like to start in the center because that kind of gives me a guide to work towards each way to get those eyeballed out to be about equal. Now keep in mind, on the top and on the bottom, you're going to lose about 1/4 inch to the seam. So I just shift my pleat down a little bit accordingly, shift it up right there to take into account that 1/4 inch that you'll lose to the seam and keep that centered. You will pleat all of your rows in one direction, and we're going to stitch in the ditch right down this line to secure those. I'm not going to stitch over a pleat and then break my thread and then sew over a pleat. I'm going to do a stitch in the ditch all the way down. And we'll do that for all of our rows. And then we're going to flip it over, and we're going to do the same thing the other direction. Same way, about 1/4 inch right down the middle, and I'm matching up my folds right here so that when I stitch it down, that line of fabric matches up just like that. So I do the same thing, stitch in a ditch all the way down, and I do like to turn my stitch length down a little bit shorter for this portion, because when I start to put polyfill in here, I want those stitches to be really tight and secure. So we will do our pleating in both directions and get that stitch down, and that's going to give us this little pocket to hold our polyfill. So when you've got your top pieced and pleated, stitched down, you're going to take this quilt top, and this is just a little 9 patch for a demonstration, but this will be your whole quilt top. So we've got the whole thing pleated and stitched down. We're going to measure this and cut a piece of backing fabric to the same size. The most important thing about your backing fabric is that it should be squared, because we're going to take these 2 pieces and sew them right sides together down 3 sides and turn it inside out. And when your backing fabric is squared, your quilt top will conform to it and give you that nice squared quilt top. So we've got it sewn at the bottom here and up these sides. This is my opening, and here's how we're going to stuff it. The first thing you want to do is sew up 2 columns. We're then going to stuff the bottom row and then secure the bottom row. I'm going to go back over that. We want to have 2 squares up while we're stuffing the bottom square, because that helps us to keep the polyfill in the square when we're stuffing it, so it's not running away from us and we're not chasing it back down in there as we're trying to sew it. So up 2 columns from the bottom, stuff the bottom row, sew the bottom row. Then we're going to come back up and stitch up 1 more column, so that when we're working on the next row, we have the same 2 square pocket while we're stuffing these. You'll go through all of your rows like that, stuff the whole quilt. When you get to the last row of squares just like this, before you sew up, you want to take your ends, fold them down about 1/4 inch, and then stitch up these lines. What that does is secures it at the top for you like that, so it's easier when you're trying to stuff it, and it's also easier to just give it a tuck when you're ready to finish and close off your quilt. That's secure, and you just stitch across it. And that gives you this lovely, lovely puff quilt. Thanks for watching.